Hi everyone, I'm Matt Lewison, I'm CEO of OpenCorp Group. Today I'm joined by a special guest to discuss some of the latest news in property investing and economics. We're going to deep dive into the Australian property market and discuss the features which impact the investing landscape, such as entry price, timing the market, alternative options to consider, market cycles, government activity, market drivers, rent and reopening of borders, among other things, and that's a lot. Today's guest is a chief economist with specific expertise in residential property. She's the most quoted property commentator in Australia and the third most quoted economist. She's a deputy chair of the Construction Forecasting Council and sits on the South East Housing Supply Expert Panel. She also provides regular updates on property market conditions to major government bodies. With more than 20 years of property research experience, her experience covers residential and commercial property from both an investor and occupier's perspective. I'm personally very pleased to be interviewing such a well-respected and knowledgeable economist in Nerida Conisbee. Nerida, it's great to have you on today.
Thanks for having me here today.
So Nerida, what's your outlook for the property market in 2022?
House prices have moved very, very quickly since the start of the pandemic. So we have seen Australian house prices increase by 24% over a 19-month time period. 2022, though, is looking very interesting, and it's highly likely we won't see that level of price growth over the next 12 months. But there are a lot of factors that need to be considered. So the first one is around finance restrictions. So APRA stepped in on the 1st of November. They did start to put in their first round of restrictions. It is highly likely that if housing finance numbers don't come down, they will step in again early next year. Interest rates are always a hot topic, and inflation is still coming in pretty high. There's speculation that the Reserve Bank may move early, although they are still saying that they won't move upwards until 2024. But obviously, an early move will really calm the market. The other factor, though, to consider is, of course, that the economy is getting back to normal again. GDP growth will be very strong. And we're also seeing more stock enter the market. So one of the problems with all the lockdowns that have occurred is that the number of properties for sale has really been reduced. And that is likely not to be such a problem in 2022.
Excellent, thank you. The entry price for housing has increased substantially over the last 18 months. How might this affect purchasing trends and property choices in the next few years? And where do you think this is likely to affect performance moving forward?
With increasing house prices, it has become very difficult for a lot of people, not only to buy their first homes, but also to upgrade. The big challenge, of course, is the deposit that is required. So trying to put together a 20% deposit if you're buying in a market like Sydney could mean that you need well in excess of $150,000, $200,000. What that means for first home buyers is that it has become more difficult. So what we've seen with first home buyer activity is that it has really pulled back quite significantly. It also raises a lot of questions around affordability, and Australia does have some of the least affordable housing in the world. There's a survey that's done every year by a group called Demographia, and Australia is always ranked very high. So affordability is a challenge. We do have an affordability inquiry that started in June of this year. We will likely see affordability being a major political issue in 2022, and so much so it is likely to be one of the key battleground issues in the 2022 federal election.
In your opinion, when is the right time to get started with property investing?
Okay. It's really hard to pick cycles, and I think one of the challenges when looking to invest in property is that people often try to look for the bottom of the cycle. So the absolute nirvana when investing is obviously buying low and selling high. The problem with property, though, is that it is very difficult to pick cycles, and even with the best information, things can come up that are completely unexpected. At its most extreme, I don't think anyone expected a pandemic to occur in 2020. We certainly didn't expect property prices to shoot up after only 2 months following the start of the pandemic to the extent that they did. So if you are looking to invest in property, the best thing to consider is buy somewhere that's great, and there's lots of great areas across Australia, and we can, and really choosing that is an art in itself. The other issue, though, is to consider holding for a longer time period. And when we have a look at when people are most likely to lose money with property, it's if they try to buy and sell quickly. If you do hold for a prolonged period, you can hold through cycles, and you can also benefit from things such as greater rental growth, urban regeneration, all those things that happen with property over a prolonged period.
Considering the benefit of market growth, but the difficulty of picking the cycle, the top and the bottom, how relevant and important is it for investors to be able to invest across borders and look outside of their own local area?
When investing in property, it is a good idea to look outside your local area. I think a lot of people do like their local area because they understand it. They're very knowledgeable of pricing. They know the streets. The reality is that when we have a look over a prolonged time period, we can see pockets of areas that have seen far stronger growth than others. Some good examples, somewhere like Hobart. Hobart now has one of the highest median house prices in Australia. I think only Canberra, Sydney and Melbourne are higher. But 10 years ago, Hobart was the cheapest market in Australia. Go somewhere like Perth and you do see quite different market cycles to what we see in Sydney. So Perth moves more closely with the iron ore pricing compared to Sydney, which is more closely linked to interest rates. Another thing to consider are regional areas, and regional areas have certainly had incredible performance through the pandemic, and a lot of it has to do with the way that people have moved to regional areas. We've had a lot of migration to those areas. We've also seen more people buy holiday homes. Mining has done very well. Agriculture has done very well. And so really considering the vast landscape of property across Australia and considering purchasing, not just in your local area, is often a really great way to generate a higher capital return.
With recent trends of people moving into the regions, among other things, different types of housing that people are choosing due to COVID, how important is it to look beyond what could be transitory trends to understand whether something is a longer term trend which might impact future prices and rents either positively or negatively?
When we look at housing demand in Australia through the pandemic, there has been a number of things that were very surprising. The first one was obviously the move to regional areas. The second was greater demand in outer suburban areas. And the third was this very strong shift up to northern New South Wales and into South East Queensland. The challenge at the moment, though, is trying to work out which of those trends are transitory and which of those trends are more permanent. Regional areas, for example, are quite interesting because some areas were actually doing very well prior to the pandemic. So if you have a look at somewhere like Geelong, relatively close to Melbourne, very good train line, was already seeing very strong price growth and very good rental market conditions. If you look further afield, we were seeing some regional areas that were quite weak, but because of the pandemic and changes to the way that people work and demand for holiday homes and those sorts of things, we did see very strong price growth that probably wouldn't have occurred without the pandemic. As we're now emerging out of these conditions, it is really important to watch pretty closely what's happening there. So things like that shift to South East Queensland, will it continue? Possibly. The Olympics are on, it's far more affordable, there's jobs growth. For more isolated regional areas, it does pay to be a little bit more cautious. And at the most extreme, mining towns are a good example, that they saw very strong growth off the back of very strong iron ore demand. But now that iron ore pricing is pulling back, they're probably going to see price declines.
In your opinion, what are some of the benefits of investing in a new versus an established property?
When investing in property, there are so many options. You can choose geographic options, you can choose apartment versus townhouse versus a house. Also, you can choose old versus new. There's lots of benefits to both. Obviously, buying new, it's likely to be easier to rent out. You get to choose a property, you get to choose where you buy. You can also take advantage of the fact that some locations are better than others. So you do have that choice of buying potentially into a new community or into an area that is quite constrained for housing supply if you're looking for a unit. Buying established, it can sometimes be more expensive. You could also be buying a home that has a lot of structural problems. You could also be buying into an area that is undergoing urban regeneration, which can really yield some really great returns over a prolonged time period. So buying new, buying established, it definitely should be a consideration, but both of them do have advantages and disadvantages.
What do you feel are the most important factors for property performance over 10 to 20 years?
The types of locations that have performed the best over the past 10, 20 years do have certain characteristics. So if you have a look as examples, somewhere like Hobart has seen a lot of population growth. It's seen a change to its local economy. So the local economy 20 years ago was primarily agriculture, it was primarily government. It has shifted to more of a tourism, arts culture. You've also had a lot of money coming from places like Melbourne and Sydney, so a lot of investment has poured in. On the other side, there's been very little housing supply, so you've had a shortage of properties, which has boosted both pricing and has also boosted the rental levels that are being achieved in Hobart. Go somewhere like the Mornington Peninsula. Mornington Peninsula is an area that has seen some of the strongest price growth in Melbourne over the past decade, and a lot of that price growth really came through during COVID and was driven by something that no one expected, which was lockdowns and people's demand for more space and a desire to be closer to the beach and closer to outdoor activities. Going up north, places like Byron Bay have also had extreme price growth over a prolonged period. So again, pretty similar to what we saw in Hobart, very constrained housing supply, a real boost to its international reputation as a result of a lot of celebrities deciding to move there, and again followed through with strong population growth. So lots of things to consider, but generally things to look at include things like population growth, things like the local economy, and also just the general desirability of what people are looking for in property over a prolonged time period.
How important is it for investors to look at the future drivers of property price growth as opposed to just the past performance of an area to determine where they should be investing?
When looking to buy property, whether investing or as an owner-occupier, it's important to understand that past performance isn't necessarily an indicator of future performance. And typically when we see very, very strong price growth of, in excess of 20, 30%, it is highly unlikely that suburb or that location will continue to see that increase in pricing over even the next 12 months. When you're looking to buy property, the future drivers do become far more important. So understanding perhaps what's been happening in similar areas on a suburb by suburb level, often we see a ripple effect. So if one suburb does start to take off, once it reaches a certain price point, people move to the next suburb along, and we often see that occurring, that next suburb then starts to take off. When we're looking on a capital city level, really understanding things like infrastructure is really important. So things like a major train line moving into an area or would lead to an increase, whereas perhaps a big freeway ripping through the suburb would probably lead to prices not performing so well. Some things that are even at a more local level are things like a really good shopping centre or a really good cafe, and there's so many examples of suburbs where you had a retail strip that was underperforming, and you suddenly get a great cafe, and that retail strip starts to do really well. You do start to see the local area and the local housing prices start to increase. Another thing to consider is schools. When we have a look at some locations, particularly with schools that are tightly zoned, that can also lead to big pickups in pricing. So there are lots of things to consider, but generally it is the case that don't look necessarily at past performance, but when you're looking at past performance, understand what drove it and then look to places where you are seeing similar trends.
If someone wanted to enter the market today but couldn't afford a deposit for a house, what other options would you suggest they consider?
Affordability is a very big challenge in Australia at the moment, and it's very difficult to get that initial deposit together. So there's things you can do if you can't afford a house. Obviously, a good idea is to look at a different suburb or a different location to the one that you're looking at. Also looking at a smaller property. So if you're looking at a house, look at a townhouse, look at a unit. Buying something that needs work is another idea. So, something that potentially you could live in or rent out at a lower rent for a little bit and then improve later on. There's also other ideas such as using a syndicate type model, so buying with a group of other investors, buying with friends or family and splitting the deposit and buying together. And buying under that group model does allow you to potentially buy something a lot better than you could buy with your own deposit or your own ability to borrow a certain amount of money.
People used to say the great Australian dream was a quarter-acre block with a nice big house on it and a carport for the two cars. Do you see that changing in the future, and how do you see that playing out across Australia?
The Great Australian Dream has definitely changed. If you have a look historically, people typically bought in the next suburb out from where their parents lived. And as a result, we have seen this quite interesting development of Australian cities, that they have just crept out and become bigger and bigger. One of the things, though, that has happened, of course, is that affordability has changed. It's become far more expensive to buy a home, but also people have begun to desire amenity as well. So people are choosing now to live closer to CBDs, closer to amenities, and that necessarily means buying something smaller because pricing does get more expensive as you move into more inner areas. So in terms of buying property, there's some things to consider. Obviously, there is a myth that houses always outperform units, and certainly at an aggregate or capital city level, we do see that. But when you have a look at unit pricing and the way unit pricing has moved in many inner suburban areas, it has actually outperformed many outer suburban housing markets. So really, when you're looking at property, try not to look too much at aggregate numbers. Do look at a suburb by suburb level, and again, just really understanding the local demographic characteristics of the suburb, the location of the suburb, the amenities of the suburb. All of those things are really important to understand.
At OpenCorp, we really look into three major drivers of the market, being supply, demand, and affordability, and they all interact with each other. And there's obviously a lot within each of those. There's a lot that you can kind of cover, from obviously the drivers of supply, which obviously government decisions, there's planning, there's even developers' decisions to bring more stock to market. And we look at probably. We talk about two different types of supply. There's current supply, which is how many properties are on the market right now, and that can change overnight. And we're seeing that at the moment in Sydney and Melbourne in particular, coming out of lockdowns. That current supply has really picked up. And then we talk about systemic supply, which is obviously the amount of houses that can be brought to market over time, the newly built apartments, units, townhouses, and homes, which take longer to bring to market. Or at least to deliver so that people can live in. What are some of the key things that you really look at and your team are looking at constantly to really understand where the market's likely to move in the next few years?
Yeah, look, there's lots of things that we look at. One of the big ones, of course, that is the hot topic is around finance, and without a doubt, drop interest rates, and you do start to see prices move, but some market, what is interesting is that some markets are very sensitive to it. So Sydney in particular is a very sensitive market to interest rate changes, and then you go somewhere like Perth, which barely moves with interest rate changes, but is very sensitive to iron ore. So, if you start to see a surge in iron ore pricing, you can be guaranteed that Perth house prices will start to move. And then there's a lot of the longer term trends, which are, things like supply is obviously such a critical factor. And I know certainly the affordability inquiry that's taking place, they are very much concentrating on supply because it is such a driver of affordability, that if you provide enough housing for people to live in, then the affordability becomes a less of an issue than if you don't have enough housing. The challenge with affordability, with housing supply, of course, is that it is highly restricted for a number of reasons. So planning is such a challenging one. NIMBYism, trying to get more housing into areas that people really love, the low density element to it is really important. And then there's also developers. Developers can hold stock. They can, they may be waiting for certain pricing. And then things like amalgamation of sites. And what's quite interesting, I sit on the South East Queensland Housing Supply Panel, and we know how much housing or how much land is available for future housing supply, but it's really difficult to understand some of those restrictive factors and how they can be moved. And things like, again, coming back to developers holding stock or amalgamation of sites, that can be quite challenging. And then, of course, demand. And demand is driven by a lot of things. I mean, it is obviously driven by population growth. So the more people moving to an area, or the more people that want to go to an area, that really lifts prices. But then also the type of people that are moving into that area can make a difference. So if you're starting to see a lot of white-collar employment growth, then that can lead to more expensive suburbs lifting. If you start to see growth in blue-collar employment, you do get quite different dynamics. And I think Adelaide's a good example of that, that prior to the pandemic, there was a lot of blue-collar employment growth, and we did start to see some really strong growth in some of the cheapest suburbs of Adelaide. But then the pandemic hit, and you started to see a lot of people working differently and seeing how cheap Adelaide was, and a lot of Sydney and Melbourne money pouring into Adelaide. And so then you started to see a lift in places like Unley and Malvern in the Adelaide market. So, there's just lots of things that are drivers, but, fundamentally it's supply and demand. But within that, there's hundreds of things that really can be going on that drive pricing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've heard some groups saying that they've got a data model that tells them where the market is most likely to go up in the future. And I kind of have a bit of a chuckle sometimes when people say that data that they've got, which is always backwards looking, tells them where the next hotspot will be. Because as you said, there's 100 different influences, and much of the data as well, if you're talking about demographic changes, I mean, we're getting that from census data, which is often 5 years old or can be up to 5 years old. Population growth, which we see 6 months behind largely. And there's such a mismatch between obviously the backwards looking data, but also what are the things that are going, like infrastructure spend, that could influence, and the type of infrastructure that's being built. So I find it really, as I said, I have a chuckle when people say my data model tells me the hotspot. Yeah. No, you get the hotspot by also being into, like, talking to people, getting your head into the market, finding out what's happening at a local or a regional level, and understanding those bigger picture trends as well. You talked a little bit about Adelaide. And Adelaide's kind of suffered from a brain drain for quite a while, hasn't it? And that a lot of people who finish university will chase the East Coast jobs, or even if they're in the mining sector often, and there's some around South Australia, they might head over to Perth. And I guess with the changes that have come about from COVID and people's perhaps propensity to want a stronger lifestyle and maybe being willing to sacrifice some things, that there's a little bit, and at least this is anecdotal from people that I speak to, I'm seeing that people are starting to move back to some of those cities where they maybe didn't think there were job opportunities in the past. Now they're like, well, I can do my job no matter where I am in the country. So is that something you see playing out in the future for a long time, or do you think that might be more of one of those transitory trends?
Yeah, look, the future of work is just so uncertain, and it was very interesting seeing how companies reacted during COVID to people being forced to work from home. And it's something that I don't think. Well, look, no one predicted it. I remember at the start of the pandemic and thinking, oh, I'll be working from home probably for the next 3 weeks, and then 2 years later, you realise you've been at home pretty much the whole time working from home. In terms of how it will play out in the future, I mean, there's, you talk to people in the commercial property industry and they're like, oh, everyone will be back in the office, and culture, you can't run your company culture just doesn't work if people aren't in the office. But then you talk to individuals, and a lot of people are very happy working from home and they enjoy it, and they're quite happy to go back into the office maybe 1 or 2 days a week and not have to do that commute. So I think the reality is it'll be a mix of both. You will see people going back to the office. You'll see some companies that do require workers to be back in the office, and if you do work for one of those companies, obviously you will need to be located in that capital city, and you probably don't really have much of a choice. But then you'll see other companies or other types of roles where it's far more flexible. So somewhere like Adelaide during the pandemic was such a great option for people, because you could go to a city like go to a suburb like Unley and buy a beautiful home in one of the best suburbs, and pay well under $2 million. And if you had a very flexible job, you could also just telecommute and do most of your work via Zoom and the like, so it became a lot easier. The other issue too, as you mentioned before, is around the brain drain from Adelaide. So people were living in Sydney but had a lot of family support in Adelaide, so I think the pandemic really helped them was a great move for a lot of people to head back and be closer to family. So yeah, I don't know whether it's transitory. It's not a transitory trend all up, but some elements of this, the changes that work has become, I think some of them will be transitory and some of them will be far more permanent.
Yeah, well, certainly technology is not going to be going backwards anytime soon. Now, we were talking a little bit earlier about some of those major drivers: supply, demand, affordability. And one of the big things that happened, obviously in 2020, was the government's response to the pandemic. And we've seen historically Australian governments stimulate the economy by trying to, funnel money into what's pretty much the largest employment generator in the country, which is the construction industry. And that obviously has flow-on effects because it's so linked in with not just construction, but also white goods and retail and furnishings and all sorts of things. So they kicked off the HomeBuilder scheme, I think it was in June 2020, and we saw a big spike in land sales, building contracts being signed. Now we're seeing obviously delays in that construction period because of supply constraints, and we're also seeing land now becoming quite scarce. As developers sold out of all of their titled stock really quickly and have been playing catch up ever since. How do you see the HomeBuilder, the cohort of new homes being constructed under HomeBuilder? How do you see that playing out from a supply perspective, considering obviously for the last 2 years we've had closed borders, so no net overseas migration? Do you see any risk in potential oversupply in areas? And how long do you think that would take to balance out?
Yeah, I don't see issues with oversupply. When we have a look at housing supply, it's generally less than what people need, and we can see that showing up in rental growth. Rental growth is a really good indicator to show whether you've got enough housing, because it's not so speculative like house prices are. People speculate on housing, but you can't speculate on rent. So it's the fact that we have seen strong rental growth for houses does suggest that this new housing supply entering the market will be required. And then, of course, we have international borders reopening as well. So, we are going to see an influx of people, and, the Australian government can turn the tap on and off as much as they want. But given we have had no migration for almost 2 years, I'd say they're going to allow quite a lot of migration to come in 2022. The other challenge is around apartment oversupply, and again, the the issue with that is it's very geographic specific. So if we have a look at what's happened to rents in Melbourne, for example, we can see the impact of what that has meant, or what enormous levels of supply have meant to rents. They have come back. But what's interesting about inner Melbourne is that Melbourne CBD, for example, it's seen, I think, a 25% drop in rents. We haven't seen an equivalent drop in value. So, we're certainly not seeing evidence of people selling out and, distressed selling, or people selling at a loss to get out of that market. So there does seem to be an element of confidence that Melbourne is an economy that is driven a lot by migration, and I think there is a perception that migration will come back, and that demand for rentals in inner Melbourne will start to pick up. And then you've got somewhere like Brisbane, where there was a lot of concerns about housing supply or rental unit supply up until, I think, around 2017, 2018. We saw a handbrake on unit development at that time, and then we've got to the pandemic, and Brisbane is broadly undersupplied for units, and now we do need to see more development there. So I don't see oversupply issues, and I don't see them emerging primarily because migration will come back, and also we're not really seeing a catastrophic drop in rents across Australia, which would signify the fact that we are in an oversupply situation.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because if you look at vacancy rates for all the capital cities around Australia, I think with the exception of two being Melbourne and Sydney, vacancy rates are well below 2%. In fact, I think in 5 of our capital cities, or 4, they're below or at or below 1%. And that would really talk to almost a crisis of lack of rental accommodation. And to overcome that, as we've talked about earlier, to produce new supply of housing takes a long time. Particularly if you're bringing it in the form of apartments or townhouses, it's probably 2 to 3 years from when you start that process. And we haven't seen that big kick up in medium to higher density construction starts, which means that for the next 2 years, that supply isn't going to be really coming through in large numbers. So I imagine that makes it really hard for government policy and housing supply council as well, but also around for APRA, because as we know, if APRA starts to play with their interest rate buffers, or even if interest rates go up, that's really going to slow down, I guess, buying activity, and particularly for new construction, which actually risks exacerbating that rental crisis, I'd imagine. Is that something that you see kind of influencing the policy moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that, because you would have read yesterday some of the comments made by the chairman of APRA around how they're looking at the housing market at the moment, and I think he got a little bit misunderstood in what people were saying, that he was kind of easing off on any future restrictions. I don't think that was the case, but his comments were more around, we can't just see loans hit X billion and then suddenly pull the handbrake on. We have to move slowly. We need to move carefully, and really sensible. It's not. You can't implement policy and then expect the next month everyone starts to behave exactly how you want them to do. Like, that's not how it works. And then, as you've said, it becomes then even more complicated, because we do have places in Australia that are in severe rental crisis. You've got somewhere like, I talk about Hobart all the time because it's so extreme, but, rents pushing ahead at levels that the average Hobart resident, really can't afford to pay. So, if you don't produce enough housing, you get to that situation. So I think, it's definitely a challenge for APRA, definitely a challenge for the Reserve Bank too. I mean, they're on one hand trying to control financial stability, but then on the other hand also being conscious that so much of what they do can influence, or does influence, housing markets and does influence housing supply. So, it is a very fine balance between, trying to control debt levels and at the same time trying to control housing supply, which the other challenge with that is that it's not all at a federal level either. There's a lot of state and local government issues that need to be considered too. So, all these things that are intertwined do control the amount of housing that's being built.
Yeah. And I think obviously it's very rare for Australia's capital cities to all be firing at exactly the same time. And it's obviously been the trend in the last sort of 12 months in particular as we've come out of COVID and kind of all the brakes are off and interest rates are low. So there's been capital appreciation pretty much everywhere. But if we go back kind of over the last decade or 2 decades, generally it's been if the Sydney and Melbourne market are booming, that's what 60% of the Australian housing market, and they're really the drivers largely of the median house price often. So when they're booming, that's often when the RBA starts stepping in to try and kind of limit price growth. So looking at the markets at the moment, Sydney and Melbourne are probably the 2 markets that don't appear to have that rental crisis. They do have a fair bit of, excess supply in the system, from our analysis. So I guess our thinking is that potentially Sydney and Melbourne might ease up enough to take the pressure off the RBA and APRA as well, in which case it potentially, I'd imagine, also kind of gives some of those other capital cities a bit more of a chance to catch up on some of the growth they've missed in the last decade. Is that your outlook what's your outlook for Sydney and Melbourne, and do you see that trend as well?
Yeah, I mean, Sydney has increased. I think price growth has gone up like 40% over the past 12 months. But, as you say, rents, have pretty much gone nowhere. So, there is a real mismatch. But that's Sydney. Sydney, because there's such a high level of speculation in that market, and people don't buy. I mean, people don't buy much property in Sydney, in Australia, wanting rental return, though. They're wanting capital growth. So, so that's something that is particularly apparent in Sydney. In terms of the outlook, I mean, it's going to be interesting once borders reopen. I think one of the things we have seen is Melbourne has relatively underperformed compared to Sydney. A lot of it has to do with that extended lockdown. It will change, or it's starting to change. It's starting to really catch up to Sydney, and once we get migration levels, we know that Melbourne is an attractor of international migrants, and so we will see that catch up. Somewhere like Perth is fascinating at the moment. So Perth has actually seen pricing come back a little bit since June. And it is being driven, it's very closely tracking iron ore. So iron ore pricing, I think, went from 240 a tonne to 120 a tonne. And then you see prices move down as a result. But you talk to people on the ground in Perth, and they're not seeing it in the premium markets, but they're seeing it in some of the more outer suburban areas. So, you start to see, some of these nuances between, the types of properties that people want. Yeah, so it will be an interesting year next year. I mean, we're starting to get all the calls for the 30% price declines, as we always get when the market starts to turn. But at this stage, it's not looking like a 30% price decline. It's not looking like a price decline at all. It's looking like prices will move, but probably at a far more moderate rate than they have moved over the past 18 months.
Yeah, and you look within some of the cities as well, and I mean, one of the areas I look at in Melbourne, for instance, the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, and not necessarily just the inner east, which has always been a really good performer. I think it's got something like, 7 of the 10 most expensive suburbs in Melbourne are in the inner east, around Boroondara and like kind of LGA. But if you go a bit further out, and this is out towards the Ringwood, Lilydale area, you've got the urban growth boundary there, you've got the Yarra Ranges, and there's very little opportunity to create new housing supply, and that's been the case for about 15 years. So we've seen that even through COVID, vacancy rates still down around 1%, where other parts of Melbourne have obviously seen much higher vacancy rates. And that obviously suggests that'll be a great performer, or continue to be a solid performer moving forward. In Sydney, what are the areas that you look at that you kind of also similar think low supply opportunities moving forward, reasonable affordability, and obviously kind of bucking the trend with that vacancy rate?
Yeah, I mean, Central Coast in Sydney is a big one. I mean, it's technically Sydney. People will often think it's not, but it is technically Sydney. That's well and truly the area that is outperforming, and it's outperforming on a rental growth perspective. It's outperforming on house price growth as well. The other area is then heading down south, which is technically regional, which is Wollongong, and particularly those northern suburbs of Wollongong are the areas that do seem to be performing well. The challenge for Sydney, it's such an expensive city, and so trying to find properties under $1 million is very difficult, even for units now. It's if you're wanting to be fairly central. The other interesting area, though, if you then move away from houses, which seems to be Central Coast and Wollongong, and going to units, a lot of it is the inner west. So particularly younger people, buying into Sydney. The inner west offers water. It's not the beach, but there's still water views. There's a lot of really great amenity in places like Leichhardt. And you can get into that market to buy an apartment for under $1 million. So we are not starting to see, but we do continue to see quite high demand. So so depending on where what you're looking for, I think Sydney is pretty mixed. But you either go really far out for a house, or you move further in and get an apartment.
Yeah, and Sydney has had a lot of the older brick walk-up apartments as well through the inner urban areas. Melbourne has some of those around Port Melbourne, South Yarra areas. How do you see those performing relative to some, I guess, the newer apartments that come through the market?
Yeah, I like the older apartments. I mean, a lot of them are a little bit bigger, and they've often got, potentially high ceilings. They've often got really nice big windows. It does depend on who built them, obviously, like any apartment development. But there's certainly a lot in urban areas that kind of look not that great on the outside, but on the inside are quite nice. So yeah, definitely something to consider, particularly if you're looking to buy a property that you can improve. We know a lot of people do like to buy something that needs a bit of work and put their own stamp on it. So definitely buying an older style apartment and doing a renovation is can yield some really good results.
Yeah, and some of the strata title laws around Australia are also changing, which for smaller low-rise buildings, starting to make it attractive for developers to come in and can pay a premium for a building, knowing that they're going to have, I guess, future development rights too. So that's something we've got our eye on. But just, I guess, talking about those older units, and I love being a student of property and looking around the world at all the different trends. But when I look at older cities like London, which I've always kind of seen, it's almost like the big sister of Melbourne, and obviously it's a city that's generally almost 3 stories high for almost as far as the eye can see. And they've got a lot of apartments, but even 1-bedroom apartments were larger, homely, kind of still had their hearth, I think they call it, and a separate kitchen and dining. And that's something that obviously Melbourne or Australia, when we went through this big urbanisation over the last 20 years, there was a shift towards much smaller, kind of almost shoebox apartments. Feels like we're shifting out of that now, and I guess we're seeing that developers are producing apartments that families might want to raise children in, like they do overseas in so many cities. Where do you think that trend is going to take us in the future?
Yeah, it's so interesting you say that. I was talking to, we've got Ray White have got a very big business on the Gold Coast, and one of the principals of that business was talking about that market and how that's changing. And he said, historically, people from interstate have come in and bought just really tiny holiday apartments, and so the high demand has been something under 400,000, super cheap. You're in there a couple of weeks a year. It kind of doesn't matter. And what he said is what's been very interesting more recently is that stock isn't selling. What is selling are the bigger apartments, and partly it is due to people having more money and wanting more luxury for a holiday home, but also because the Gold Coast is changing such a lot, and a lot of younger people are moving in and they want to be near the beach. They want something, and to be near the beach now, you're more likely to be able to afford an apartment, and you potentially want to live in that apartment for a lot longer than you may have, but that people may have wanted to do in previous generations. So, I think for young people buying property, the idea of living in an apartment for far longer is a reality, but for it to be a reality, they do need to be bigger and more comfortable to be able to, handle a couple or potentially a child, or, more than a single person that some of the smaller apartments would be able to handle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think resale is such an important thing to understand. Like, you want to, when you're reselling a property or you're buying a property and you think, one day I'm going to have to sell this, I want the broadest market possible. And I guess those older, or those more recent, or not so much more recent, the shoebox apartments that were designed for investors to get a good rental yield are only ever going to appeal to another investor, which means you're really cutting out a big part of the market in the future resale. But I want to, I guess, double back to something we talked about earlier, and you mentioned about Perth, which has been a really interesting market and kind of unique at the moment in many ways, in that we have seen a bit of a pullback in price growth in Perth, probably before some of the other capital cities. And that's quite a surprise to us as well, because the vacancy rate in Perth, I think, is 0.8%. I think at the moment has been at that level on a sustained basis. For most of this year, we've seen rents going up 15 to 20% in Perth. So again, it talks to there being an undersupply of housing, and it hasn't flowed through to I guess that price growth. How long do you think the market can kind of sustain that rent growth, that undersupply that they've got, and not see a blow up in prices, perhaps from the bottom at some point?
Yeah, look, Perth is fascinating. I mean, like you said, it has seen this incredible rental growth. We've seen, on one hand, prices I don't think they've quite got back to where they were in the previous boom, but rents are, well and truly above, and a very low vacancy rate. It's starting to need new housing supply. I think with Perth, what we're seeing now does seem to be very speculation driven. People have seen the drop in the iron ore price. The borders are still blocked. There's a few concerns. Everyone knows that Perth is a mining town. It's not a town that has a diversity of economic drivers. The thing for Perth that will help is borders being reopened, and that will help the local economy as well. So that will bring in more people. The flow on from that is that rental issue will become even more apparent. So once borders open, once people start to come in, there will need to be more housing developed, and we will see that flow on to pricing. So I think it is an interesting market, and then fundamentally the iron ore price, we don't know exactly where it's going to go. So it has dropped a lot, but it probably will pick back up. I mean, it's not like the economic growth has suddenly come to a halt. We know China is still on a building phase. We know that the rest of the world is trying to use infrastructure to generate growth. So all of those will flow through. So I think it is an interesting market, but I suppose one of the things for Perth is be mindful of all the drivers, and not just a couple. Certainly not interest rates, but not just iron ore, but look at some of the more broader aspects that are driving it.
So we talked, you mentioned briefly about, governments around the world that are stimulating economies through infrastructure and so on. And we're seeing that obviously starting to have an impact on costs almost everywhere in the world. Supply constraints are obviously having an impact as well. Are you looking, at those types of, or how are you looking at those types of influences on the market, and do you see them washing through the system in terms of supply constraints and cost increases on construction materials?
Yeah, look, it's interesting looking at the most recent inflation figures. So they came in at 3% for the September quarter, but it was very much driven by the increase in building costs and also the increase in fuel, particularly petrol costs. In terms of how that will flow through to next year is interesting. It's interesting because if you have a look at one of the big constraints on building costs, it is supply chains, and supply chains are very blocked at the moment, and they're not handling the capacity. And I kind of think of it like an old car. When you start an old car and you're kind of in a hurry, you want it to move quickly, but that old car is just taking a while to has to get to a certain level before it can really move. And I think of that when I think of supply chains, is that, they haven't been used that much in the last 2 years, as much as they would have otherwise been used. And now everyone's wanting stuff and we want it right away, and, they're struggling to cope with demand. So if it is that, and that is, fundamentally the problem, then those supply chains should become unblocked next year sometime. And already, I'm in Sydney. I'm sure a similar situation is playing out in Melbourne. That anything that I ordered online in Melbourne, in Sydney, during the lockdown, it took ages for me to get it, but suddenly everything's arriving quite quickly, and even at a local level I can see those supply chains or that mail, all those parcels are now starting to move through a little bit quicker. So I think that will come. Those supply chains will become unplugged, I guess is the right word for it, sometime, possibly mid next year, and things will flow a lot quicker. Fuel costs are a little bit more complicated because petrol in particular is really being pushed up by not only us getting back out there and driving cars and using flying planes and all the rest that we weren't doing during the pandemic, but we also have OPEC and a lot of the oil producing nations pulling back on supply. So they're using now as to their advantage. Oil futures went negative last year. They lost a lot of money. Now's the time to make up for lost ground. So again, that could change overnight. You could see a release of more fuel into the economy, and then suddenly fuel prices start to moderate and things look a lot easier. So my view personally is that it's transitory. The problems will be if those fuel prices remain high and those supply chain blockages don't go away. I mean, that's when we will start to see a problem with inflation extending over a prolonged period.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because with CPI, and obviously there's a basket of goods, and some of those things where we're seeing prices going up, people need. It's almost unavoidable that you need. Some things like fuel is often one of them. And Australia is such a small part of the global economy that if there's cost pressure coming from the outside world, from all of the other countries in the world, there's only so much influence that the Australian or the Reserve Bank of Australia can have over inflation here, right? And I mean, I think more specifically in construction materials, we saw, I think it's the spot price for a cubic meter or cubic lineal meter of timber went from $400 US to $1,800 US. It's come back to $650 now, but we're not sure how long that'll take to flow through to Australia, and certainly there's probably a degree of profit taking now for some suppliers who go, well, people are paying this price and there's demand, I might as well keep the price there. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting 6 months ahead, and I know that I guess anybody who's starting to look at building, I guess the important thing would be trying to lock in prices and supply as well. Talking internationally, what markets do you like to watch outside of Australia that you kind of think are great learning opportunities for us?
Yeah, I mean, like you, I do love watching international markets for property. I do get a lot of ideas from the US, so I do try to read a lot of articles of just analysis that's done over there. I find that quite fascinating. But also, I guess the diversity of pricing in that country. It's interesting. I do a little bit with Mansions Global, and they will often talk about $1 million suburbs. And I'm thinking here in Sydney, $1 million suburbs is, Blacktown, which is the highest crime rate suburb in Sydney, is $1 million suburb. And so $1 million in Australia doesn't really get you what it probably gets you in probably most cities in the US. So I find that super interesting. The other one I really love watching Hong Kong. I've spent a lot of time working over there, so have come to get a good understanding of that market. And that market's fascinating because when you have a look at the ratio of income to house prices, it's well and truly the least affordable country in the world by a long shot. There's nothing that comes close to Hong Kong in terms of pricing. So it is a very expensive city. It's also very dense, and so, the housing is not only very expensive, but it's very small, and so I find that interesting. But also around the extreme nature of land ownership in that country. So you do have a small number of players that own most of the land, and so you do see, I guess, what many people in Hong Kong perceive as control of pricing. So that's interesting to watch. And then I probably could talk every market, but then China. China is fascinating because of the way they'll pull handbrakes on really quickly in cities, and overnight suddenly your apartment is worth less than what you thought it was because the Chinese government has said that's what your apartment's worth. And I find that level of extreme policy formation quite interesting because it's obviously you could never do it in Australia, but they certainly do it in China.
Looking forward at population growth, and you've just talked about a number of cities or countries as well that have huge populations. Australia's sitting around 25 million, and it's a big debate around a big Australia, I think, and it's very polarising. I guess our understanding of some of the drivers of the situation, which has generally had bipartisan support in the past to continue a reasonably high level of net overseas migration coming into Australia to address, I guess, the ageing population that we have, the reduction in working age people relative to the number of retirees. And I imagine, and again, looking historically at Australia and how we've managed crises, and particularly economic crises, where the government's pumped money in to the system and then sought to grow the economy, the size of the economy, to help, I guess, reduce the level of debt relative to gross domestic product. And that would probably lead one to assume that if you want to grow the economy and you can't always just export more stuff because we're in a competitive environment, you can increase the size of the economy by importing people. And then obviously you've got more consumers in the market as well, helping to pay taxes and helping to deal with that debt. How likely, where do you think Australia's population will go from here? Not necessarily just in the next 2 years, but probably more medium to longer term. And do you think that's going to change the makeup of our cities and where people settle at a certain point?
Yeah, we could talk about this all day. It's such a massive topic and obviously so divisive. Some people see migration as, such a terrible thing and leads to higher unemployment and housing affordability challenges, whereas other people are, mindful that it does create economic growth and really we wouldn't be such a vibrant country without it. In terms of what no migration or low migration means long term, I think a good place to look is Japan. And Japan has been pretty much in recession for 20 years. They've got they pretty much allow no one in. So they do have a rapidly aging population, which they are struggling with. But what I find most interesting about Japan is looking at what has happened to house prices in that country as a result of zero migration. And what's happened is that you do have some places that are so affordable that people walk away from houses because they don't, they're worth nothing. They don't want to pay rates. They don't want anything to do with them. So they, chuck the keys, walk away. Then you've got somewhere like Tokyo, and Tokyo pricing is expensive, and it goes up, and so what has happened in that country is you've got a clear out of the regions, and people piling into, the economic centre or the economic centres of Japan. And as a result, house prices still go up, like they always go up, but, everything else in the country is worth nothing. So I think in Australia, that won't happen, but, at the most extreme, it's not like we stop migration and then suddenly prices fall across Australia in a very even keel. And we've seen that in the last 2 years, is that while people, while we haven't had international migration, we've had interstate migration. And you've had somewhere like South East Queensland, which has seen a big pickup in population because people have been drawn up there, particularly from Melbourne and Sydney, because people in Melbourne and Sydney don't want to be in lockdown didn't like being in lockdown for a prolonged period, and were looking for sunshine, space, affordability. So, they moved up there. So it is a complicated one, but I think fundamentally we do rely on migration for workers. We rely on migration for economic growth. Foreign students have been a key driver of economic growth for many cities. If you have a look in Victoria, the number one export for Victoria isn't agriculture, it's not minerals, it is actually education. So, there's so much that is so critical about migration for Australia that to cut it significantly would have terrible negative impacts on the country.
Yeah, spot on. I mean, talking about price growth as well, and you mentioned obviously I think Japan, and again it's such a contrast, and it kind of talks to the fact that even across countries, and we've talked earlier about within cities themselves, there can be a big difference in one area to another in terms of what's driving the market and how they respond to different circumstances. But we've obviously seen prices, and you mentioned Sydney, where a lot of suburbs are over $1 million now. I got interested in property in the 80s when my dad became a property investor, and he bought a house to knock down and put up 4 units. And I was 5 at the time, and I remember being involved in that and really just started to tune into what he was doing. And he'd been surrounded by he was working for a concrete company in an office, and the Italian I guess property investors were like running the company and just telling everybody about their property portfolio. So that was how Dad's passion started. But he came out of that, and he had all these kind of sayings that he had heard from those guys about, Steve, property prices will double in the next 10 years. They doubled last 10 years up. So he would tell us property prices double every 8 to 10 years. And I think when I started to get really into it, I wanted to know why. And because everybody, when you say it to enough people, they go, it can't happen, because in 10 years' time, and this is when prices were 200,000, they'll be 400, and then 10 years later, they're almost 1 million, as if that's going to happen. And now we're really there. And I guess people are probably imagining right now, surely prices won't double to 2 million in the next 10 years. And I guess if I'm a cynic, if I try to be cynical, I'd say, well, inflation has been less than it was for, like, over the last 50 years, it was a lot higher, and it's been trending down. It might spike back up. So I guess at an economic level, you would assume price growth happens at a premium to inflation at some point. I'm not sure what that premium level is. So if inflation's low, theoretically, prices shouldn't double at the same rate. But when you look towards the future and over the next 10 years, do you see that prices could still double, and how will inflation play into that, and any other, I guess, issues?
It's such a hard one. I think, I suppose when I know that one doubles every 10 years, but, the reality is that it's not true. You look at somewhere like Perth, and prices have come back over 10 years, and then, you've got to pick the cycle to get that doubling of price. And right now we've seen a very sharp acceleration in pricing, and the reality is it's probably going to be flat for quite some time. And what we see in Sydney and Melbourne as well is you see this big jump, and then things kind of flatten out, and then they take off again, and so that's kind of the movement that takes place. Whether it could double again in 10 years, I don't know. Like, I don't think from this point now they will double in 10 years, but possibly from, if you have a look at just prior to the pandemic, that point to the next 10 years, possibly. So I think, it's really important, I think, around the timing of where you look at prices and of course, where you're looking in the market, because, who knows, Tasmania could suddenly see this building boom and you see thousands and thousands of new houses being developed and, this is not going to happen, but, at its most extreme, and then suddenly prices flatten out. So, a lot can happen over a 10-year time period. But I think it is really important to know that, we don't always see this step growth over a 10-year time period. There's periods of surges, there's periods of flat, you see declines, and, you've kind of got this process that takes place over a prolonged time period.
Yeah, and I think it's important for everyone to know as well that, no one's got a crystal ball. We don't know where, or how much prices will go up in the future, or if they will go up in every area or go down in some. Obviously, some of the drivers we know, as interest rates go down, that tends to push up prices. You mentioned earlier as well, we've been in a real super cycle over the last, 30, 40 years since interest rates were at 18% variable. And obviously they've come down to around 2% people have been able to borrow at, and that's probably going to reverse a little bit. But now an incremental change in interest rates when you're at 2 or 3% has a much bigger impact than an incremental change when you're at 6 or 7%. So they shouldn't need to tighten it as much to start to see that having an impact. And wages growth is probably the other. And we've been in while interest rates have been coming down generally, wages growth has been kind of shrinking. And that's what the RBA really wants to kind of ramp up to. So if we look at wages, and again, this is kind of the $1 million question for many families around Australia, how realistic is it that we'll get off this anemic wage growth that we've had for the last 10 years?
Yeah, gosh, I think everyone hopes so. I think it has been pretty, it has been very low. At the same time, obviously, corporate profits have been really high. It's not an area that I'm particularly an expert in, but you can certainly see right now that zero migration over a 2-year time period has led to more power in employees' hands, and it's more apparent in some industries than others that there is a shortage of people, and if you want people, you're going to have to pay them more. We're seeing it play out even at a far more extreme way in the US at the moment. I read a story about a McDonald's in one of the cities there having to pay people $50 to come just to an interview. So, I don't know if we'll get to, I don't think we'll get that extreme, but there is certainly now quite a bit of bargaining, I think, that can be done by people that can bargain in their employment, but certainly even, at all levels, whether you're in the construction industry, whether you're in fruit picking, people need labour, and to be able to get the best labour, their money does play a massive role in people's decision making. So it will play out that my view is that wages will have to increase as a result.
Yeah, I think I remember 04 through to 08 in South East Queensland, where I was working at the time in Brisbane, we saw really solid wage growth. Obviously, through recruiting people, I was seeing it kind of on a monthly basis, and obviously even then team members getting poached elsewhere. And we're in the property industry, and that obviously isn't an example of the entire industry, but certainly in the resources sector as well. And that kind of fed through to other parts of the Brisbane economy, and we were in a really strong price growth cycle. We were also seeing lots of people moving north from interstate, chasing more affordable property and, I guess, strong jobs. And Brisbane's median wage pretty much hit par with, I think it was $1,000 a year less than Sydney's median wage, and it was slightly above Melbourne's, but our median house price at the time was well below, and that obviously played catch up quite a bit in terms of that house price as a result of that. And that was probably the strongest market cycle I'd seen beyond 1 year, because I think it ran for about 2.5. years and cut off just before the GFC hit. Probably last question for today. You've mentioned South East Queensland being a hot spot in terms of interstate migration. Brisbane was announced as the Olympic city for 2032, and there's a lot of commentary around what that means, and certainly people say that means prices are going to go through the roof, and it's hard to imagine that an announcement makes prices go up on its own, but certainly it will create more jobs and things like that. What's your view of South East Queensland? You're on the Housing Supply Council in South East Queensland. How much do you think Brisbane or South East Queensland really has to go, I guess, in the tank at the moment? And do you see any pressure release mechanism coming by way of new supply?
Yeah, I mean, South East Queensland is moving very quickly at the moment, and migration is part of it, but holiday homes is another one. You know, people buying holiday homes has been a key contributor. It doesn't look like it's slowing. Well, it's not slowing. I mean, when we have a look at the price growth in the last 3 months in Brisbane, it's actually been higher than it was in the previous 3 months. So it looks like it's still picking up in terms of what we're seeing with pricing. In terms of who's buying, I mean, what was interesting over the weekend is when we have a look at a lot of the auctions that were taking place, there were a lot of Sydney and Melbourne bidders still, and they weren't necessarily people that were wanting to move up there, but they were people that were very interested in investing up there because price point's lower, there's a lot of positivity in the market, there's migration, there's the Olympics, you know, all these things that are really boosting conditions. When you have a look at housing supply, it's quite interesting looking in that area. I mean, Gold Coast is the one, and you mentioned it earlier, and Gold Coast being the most constrained for housing supply. You know, there's not a lot of location, a lot of movement you can do to expand houses, but there is a lot of movement that can be done around high density. And when people think of Gold Coast, they think of high-rise, but the reality is it's just a very thin strip of high-rise, and the rest of it is kind of 600 square metre blocks that have a lot of redevelopment potential. So I think on the Gold Coast, you know, if you owned a house on the Gold Coast, or even if you buy a house now, I think, you know, you're fairly, not guaranteed, but you're in a good position to take advantage of what's happening in that market, because it has really moved from being a boom bust holiday market to being an economy that is being driven by local things such as education, tourism. Still, you know, people are working flexibly, so have moved there. So, you know, that market I think is one to look very, very closely at. Brisbane isn't as constrained. You know, Brisbane you can keep building out and out, but it is really affordable. I mean, it was interesting. I was looking at $1 million suburbs. You know, it's one of those ones that everyone loves to talk about, and Brisbane only just saw its first $2 million suburbs in the last couple of months. So Tenerife and New Farm just hit that level. And when we look historically, 10 years ago, there was only 5 $1 million suburbs. And then you look at 20 years ago, and the most expensive, in 2001, the most expensive suburb in Brisbane was Ascot, and the median price I think was around $460,000. So, you know, it's just seeing quite incredible growth, but it's still very, very affordable for a city that is attracting so many people. And then Sunshine Coast is different again. You know, that it isn't so constrained for housing supply. So, you know, it's not such an issue as we're seeing on the Gold Coast, but it is obviously a very, very popular holiday destination. So going near the beach is very, very expensive now, but then that has flowed through to inland areas, and trying to buy in a suburb that is under $1 million on the Sunshine Coast is very difficult at the moment. So I think, you know, for now, like right now, South East Queensland is very, very hot, and then I think, you know, really how they take advantage of the Olympics, whether they can maintain that high level of migration. I think they're the key things as to what will maintain that momentum in that market. Yeah, it's
you talking about the potential supply around Brisbane and even the Sunshine Coast, and I think this is one issue where supply constraints really come in as well. And I know that there's a lot of developer land banking is a bit of a buzzword that the media likes to hold on to. And obviously, having worked for large developers in the past, if a developer can make a profit, they'll bring and they can deliver it, they'll absolutely go to market. But there are often constraints to bringing land out. Even if they've got a big contiguous parcel, there's supply constraints, labour. And that's another thing we're seeing at the moment in South East Queensland is that the designers, the engineers, the contractors are all got very stretched workbooks and can't get to their next stages as fast as they would like. So we're starting to see titles blowing out to 12, 18 months from people signing contracts now, which I guess creates also a potential for speculation. We saw that in 06, 07 in WA when buyers would sign contracts never intending to settle, and they would try and flip, and you would see that kind of rapid escalation of prices and properties changing hands multiple times. So we're not seeing the changing of hands of contracts yet, but I guess that the door is starting to open because people are signing a contract, making $100,000 between contract signing and settlement. So yeah, that's going to be, I guess, an interesting one for us to watch. But probably another thing that I find really interesting in South East Queensland is the difference in the way that the market operates. And it's a lot less transparent than Sydney and Melbourne. So I moved back to Brisbane on the start of this year. I'd been planning it last year and we put it off because of COVID. And we're in the market for properties. One was supposed to go to auction, and it kind of went through a silent auction quietly a week before it was ever due to go to auction. And my wife and I had put in an offer and kind of never heard anything, chased the agent. Eventually got a call back. They said, "Oh no, we've got a few offers, so you're going to have to put your price up." I mean, are we competing against ourselves here? And talking to others who were involved in that kind of process said the same thing. So that's really common in Brisbane, that you don't know what the price is going to be until something's changed hands. And I guess the downside of that is that price growth can creep up on you. That in Melbourne, you turn up, in Sydney, you turn up at an auction, the price changes. You see the median move that week. In Brisbane, you might not see the median move, and all of a sudden it jumps 7-8% for a suburb because all of a sudden all these properties that started changing hands quietly have now settled. So again, does that make it hard from a prediction?
Brisbane.
Sorry if I'm asking a very closed question there.
No, that's okay. I mean, you can't even. I don't think agents are even allowed to advertise a price on a listing. So you're right about that transparency. It is very, very frustrating. I mean, that price growth does catch up because, as you said, the delay is such an issue. And when we look at price growth, you can feed in what agents are reporting, but you don't get the actual price that it's sold at properly from the Valuer General, often for 60, 90 days. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in Brisbane over coming months as to whether that momentum will be maintained. And what we are seeing too, which is really apparent in the South East Queensland market at the moment, is that people in Brisbane are looking historically at pricing, and seeing how it went and sort of judging, what sold in their street in the last 2 weeks and saying, well, that's probably what that new property will sell for. Whereas what we're seeing is people from Melbourne and Sydney are saying, oh, well, $2 million. Well, compare that to what I can buy on the northern beaches of Sydney. This is in the best suburb of Brisbane, and I may have sold my house in Sydney, or I may have been looking in Sydney, and suddenly this looks really affordable. So I think what seems to be happening is an adjustment of benchmarks, and instead of it really being driven by local buyers, you've got all this, this flood of money, and they're sort of resetting the benchmark. And so, I think that's one of the key factors at the moment that really is pushing up pricing in that market.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.